"You're going to have a baby girl," Milo declared, staring intensely at me with his big blue eyes. "But there will be struggles and pain before she arrives." A hush fell over the living room as all eyes turned towards the 11-year-old boy. My cousin Amanda's face flushed red. "Milo, don't say such things," she scolded, flustered. "I'm so sorry, Bryn. You know how kids can be with their wild imaginations." I forced an awkward smile, trying to diffuse the uncomfortable tension that had settled over our small family gathering. No need to apologize. I'm sure he's just excited at the prospect of having a new little cousin to play with someday. Milo shook his head adamantly. "I'm not making it up, Mom. I saw it clear as day, like I was watching a movie in my mind." An uneasy silence lingered as Amanda searched for the right response. Before she could find the words, little Milo continued. "The baby will be beautiful, Bryn, with dark curls and green eyes, just like you. But there's a fork in the road you'll face. One path is safer, but filled with regrets and what-ifs. The other leads to your daughter, but is treacherous. Obstacles from someone you trusted will try to block your way." My chest tightened as Milo's haunting words washed over me. There was a conviction in his tone that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. For as long as I could remember, he had displayed an unsettling knack for making disturbingly accurate observations well beyond his years. Ever since Alex and I had started trying to have a child over a year ago, I couldn't help but envision our future with a house filled with the joyous sounds of little feet pattering across the floors. Was Milo's eerie prediction giving voice to the dream I had secretly been nurturing, or was this merely an overly fertile child's imagination gone wild? "Honey, you know Grandma gets worried when you say such peculiar things," Amanda said, her voice a frantic whisper as she tried to rein in her son's ramblings. But Milo's gaze remained transfixed on me, utterly undeterred. "You're strong, braver than you know, Bryn. When the dark clouds gather, don't lose your way. The rain will give way to a beautiful rainbow." I felt Alex's comforting hand on my shoulder, pulling me back to the present moment. He leaned in close, his warm breath tickling my ear. "Try not to dwell on it, babe. You know how worked up Milo can get with his overactive mind." Attempting to compose myself, I plastered on a smile and nodded. Yet no matter how fervently I tried to shake off Milo's foreboding words, they clung to me like a burr. A lingering sense of unease took root, leaving me wondering what turbulent road might lie ahead. The ding of the elevator signaled my arrival at the marketing floor where I worked at Harrison and Associates. Stepping out, I immediately spotted Alex huddled with a group of colleagues, going over analytics for an upcoming campaign. He looked up, and our eyes met. A warm smile crept across his face, his brown eyes crinkling at the corners in that way that never failed to make my heart skip a beat, even after 7 years of marriage. "There's my gorgeous wife," he called out as I approached. "Don't you all agree Bryn is a total knockout?" A chorus of laughs and agreeable murmurs followed from his coworkers. I felt my cheeks flush slightly at the compliment. "Well, aren't you just a sweet talker today?" I replied, planting a quick peck on his cheek, though I seem to recall someone asking for my mother's famous pecan pie recipe earlier. Alex grinned sheepishly. "You know me too well. I was simply banking future brownie points to cash in later." The evening passed in a blur of prospecting calls, client meetings, and a welcomed break to share lunch together in the company cafeteria. As we chatted about our days, my thoughts inevitably drifted back to Milo's harrowing prediction. "Did I tell you Milo said the most bizarre thing at Amanda's house the other night?" I began, keeping my tone light. Alex nodded slowly, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. "About us having a kid? Yeah, I overheard some of it. The little guy has one hell of an imagination, that's for sure." "He was so specific, though," I persisted, unable to shake the niggling feeling that there was more to Milo's words than an overactive fantasy. The details about her looking like me with dark curls and green eyes, and the obstacles we'll apparently face from someone close to us. Alex waved his hand dismissively. "You can't honestly believe any of that nonsense, can you? Milo's a bright kid, but he's got a habit of rambling. You know how kids can get tangled up in their own little make-believe worlds." His reassuring tone sounded sincere enough. And yet, didn't he seem almost defensive? Before I could dwell further, the shrill ring of Alex's cell phone interrupted my thoughts. "It's my mom," he grumbled, not even glancing at the display before declining the call. You know how she is. A missed call is practically a federal crime in Elaine's world. I'll catch up with you in the office, babe. Planting a quick kiss on my cheek, Alex excused himself and stepped into the hallway to return his mother's call. I tried not to read too much into his weary sigh and slight grimace. Truth be told, Elaine was, well, a piece of work was putting it mildly. She meant well, I kept reminding myself. Surely her overbearing, controlling tendencies merely stemmed from her profound love for her family, misguided as they may be. Yet that rationalization rang increasingly hollow lately. Over the years, I couldn't ignore the blatant favoritism she displayed towards Alex's younger brother Dominic, her obvious golden child, and her T727 underhanded comments about how Alex and I were dragging our feet. To start a family certainly didn't help matters. A harsh cackle from outside the cafeteria snapped me back to attention. Peering out, I watched as Alex paced back and forth, the phone cradled against his ear. I'd know the clipped, impatient tone of Elaine's voice anywhere, even from a distance. Though I couldn't make out the words, her willfully oblivious son hung on every chiding utterance as his shoulders sagged lower with each passing second. My heart ached at the dispirited expression he tried and failed to conceal. Yet just as quickly a flicker of resentment ignited within me. Would I ever stop watching that insufferable woman slowly break down the spirit of the man I loved? As if sensing my gaze, Alex glanced up in my direction. Seeing me witness his humiliation, his face flushed crimson. I opened my mouth to, well, I wasn't quite sure what I intended to convey. Outrage? Reassurance? Sympathy? In that fleeting instant, a profound revelation washed over me. There were deeper currents churning beneath the surface here, far more tumultuous than I could possibly fathom, and they were swiftly sweeping me and my family towards uncharted and potentially perilous waters. The annual Springville Community Fair was in full swing when Alex and I arrived hand in hand that crisp April evening. The scent of funnel cakes and buttered popcorn wafted through the cool air as crowds meandered between rows of game booths and rides. This brings back memories, Alex reminisced with a nostalgic grin, giving my hand an affectionate squeeze. I can still smell the hot dogs my dad used to grill up while we played skee-ball for hours on end. Pretty sure that's just the aroma of the fair's famous behemoth foot-long corn dogs wafting over, I teased. As we strolled along the bustling thoroughfare, I spotted a familiar mane of auburn curls in the distance. Oh, hey, there's your mom over by the ring toss. Alex followed my gaze, his expression clouding briefly before smoothing over into a polite smile. I'll be damned, that is Elaine, being her usual center of attention self. Sure enough, the elegant Elaine Harrison was regaling a small crowd with some dramatic tale, her perfectly manicured hands gesturing animatedly. Even from across the fairgrounds, I could make out the tinkling of her practiced, mirthful laugh. I swear that woman could spin a crocheted potholder into a Tony Award-winning one-woman show, Alex muttered with a rueful shake of his head. Before I could respond, Elaine's gaze settled upon us. Her eyes ignited with an unmistakable glint of recognition, or was it something more akin to predatory relish? "Oh, Alexandra!" she trilled in a saccharine sing-song without preamble. "And if it isn't my daughter-in-law, Bryn, what a fortuitous coincidence." She navigated her way through the dispersing throng with the regal bearing of a debutante. Up close, I couldn't help but marvel at her meticulously groomed appearance, not a single silver hair out of place. "Mom," Alex replied with a curt nod. "Fancy running into you here." Elaine unleashed a theatrical pout. "Is that any way to greet your dear old mother?" Here I thought my beloved only son might spare his doting parent the occasional embrace. Alex shifted his weight uncomfortably, but dutifully complied with a stiff, one-armed hug. Elaine clung a moment longer than necessary, as if savoring her dominance. "You simply must come meet my friends from the Ladies' Historical Society, Bryn dear," she simpered, hooking her arm through mine before I could politely demur. "Why, I was just regaling them with the most delightful anecdote about you and Alexandra when you were mere babes." Unable to extricate myself, I bit the inside of my cheek to stifle the impulse to chuckle derisively at her self-proclaimed delightful anecdotes. They inevitably devolved into backhanded compliments and barbed condescension, thinly veiled as charming banter. "They're enthralled, I'm sure," Alex deadpanned as we trailed behind his domineering mother. "Oh, hush now, you incorrigible cynic. Where are your manners?" Elaine clucked in a lofty, wounded tone over her bony shoulder, although heaven knows I shouldn't remark on what I sought to instill in you at such a tender age. I glanced over at Alex, who merely shrugged in response while massaging his temples, clearly a conditioned reflex developed over years of enduring his mother's digs. I felt the hairs on the nape of my neck prickle as an intrusive thought took root. What if Milo had been right? What if the obstacles he forewarned truly were orchestrated by someone closest to us? Would that manipulative puppet master be none other than the steel magnolia leading us along in her wake like marionettes bound to her strings? For the first time since hearing his chilling prediction, I couldn't completely dismiss Milo's words offhand. Not anymore. Elaine paused in her tracks, swiveling sharply to face us with an inquisitive arch of a perfectly sculpted eyebrow. "Is something the matter, dears? You both look positively stricken." She tsked lightly while shaking her head in vague disapproval. "Honestly, Alexandra, that brooding petulance might have been a charming look on you when you were a boyhood scamp, but on a grown man it's simply wearying." Alex opened his mouth as if to retort, but then visibly deflated. I watched as the fleeting defiance guttered in his eyes, instantly extinguished. In that moment, my throat constricted with a swell of emotions: frustration, sorrow, impotent rage. Yet beneath it all, an iron-willed determination took root. If Milo's vision was indeed a harbinger of the turmoil to come, then I would be ready. Whatever tempestuous destiny awaited on the road ahead, I wouldn't allow Elaine's machinations to steer us off course. Not if I had any say in the matter. The cloying scent of Elaine's overpowering gardenia perfume lingered in the air even after we departed the fairgrounds and arrived back home. I wrinkled my nose in mild disgust at the phantom aroma, just one more layer to peel back in the ever-complexing enigma that was my mother-in-law. Well, that was certainly an experience, Alex sighed, shrugging off his jacket. He hung it over the back of a chair, looking as mentally drained as if he'd just run a marathon. We'd barely been in Elaine's presence for an hour, but her potent dose of toxicity always managed to leave us utterly depleted. "You've got to admit she's a real piece of work," I agreed wryly. "Did you happen to catch what she was whispering to that friend of hers after you excused yourself to take that call?" Alex pinched the bridge of his nose, grimacing. "You mean when she proclaimed in a stage whisper how I was forever disappointing her expectations? Yeah, that's pretty much par for the course with Mother Dearest." "Even for her, that was harsh," I murmured, sliding an arm around his waist. A few beats of silence passed between us. Then, seeming to brace himself, Alex exhaled loudly. "Listen, Bryn. I've been meaning to talk to you about something," he began slowly, averting his gaze, as if steeling himself for a thorny conversation. My heart skipped a beat, bracing for bad news over some looming work crisis or other catastrophe. "Mom's been, well, saying some things lately that have got me thinking," he continued, his words gradually gaining momentum. "About us not having kids yet after being married all these years, and I know we've discussed it, but—" "Hold up," I interjected, recoiling slightly. Of all the things I'd braced myself for, I hadn't anticipated this conversational U-turn, much less for him to be parroting Elaine's refrains. "Are you actually taking parenting cues from your mother right now?" Alex held up his hands in a placating gesture. "Hear me out, babe. I'm not looking to pile on the pressure or anything, just maybe she has a point this time?" I arched an incredulous eyebrow. Elaine Harrison had permanently forfeited the benefit of any doubts from me long ago. "All I'm saying is, you can't deny the nonstop hints are starting to carry a ring of truth," Alex pressed on. "My brother's already knocked up wife number 2, with number 3 likely on the way before long. And here we are, hitting our mid-30s with not even the pitter-patter of one set of little feet around the house." An inexplicable lump formed in my throat as I dredged up the recurring ache that had taken root, the one I'd tried my damnedest to stifle over the past couple years. "You think I don't agonize over that every single heartbeat?" I shot back, unable to mask the desperation that had begun creeping into my voice. Month after month of procedures and negative tests and putting on a brave smile for yet another baby shower? Milo's recently prophesied words about our future child reverberated like a thunderclap. I could practically picture her in my mind's eye, just as he'd described. Dark ringlets framing an impish face, emerald eyes brimming with uninhibited joy and curiosity. Alex reached over and squeezed my hand, his expression softening. I hated how naked and vulnerable admitting my innermost yearnings aloud made me feel. As if he could instantly see the repressed hopes and dreams I'd compacted like a tightly wound coil all this time. "I'm not trying to make this into a fight, Bryn. You know I want a baby just as much as you," he soothed in a gentler tone. "And for what it's worth, whatever Mom's warped motivations, she does have a damn good point this time. We can't just keep putting it off forever." I digested this in silence, fidgeting with the fraying end of a throw blanket just to avoid Alex's plaintive gaze. Of course, he was right. There was no sense in denying the growing void any longer. You're right, I conceded softly. A mirthless chuckle escaped my lips. God, I can't believe I'm actually saying this, but your mother may have inadvertently done us a favor here. One dark brow arched in bemusement. Come again? We're talking about the same Elaine Harrison here, right? Just hear me out, I said, holding up a finger as the first tendrils of revelation began worming their way into my consciousness. What if Elaine's constant needling wasn't just her being a nagging busybody, but something else entirely? Like she subconsciously knew this was one area she didn't have control over. Alex opened his mouth to protest, but I pressed onward, now unable to stop the deluge of epiphanies from tumbling forth. Don't you see? All this time, we've assumed she was just reflexively sticking her nose where it didn't belong. But what if there was more to it? What if she was provoking us intentionally because she wanted to undermine our growing family before it could even begin? The crease deepening between Alex's furrowed brows was the only confirmation I needed. In that instant, the wool was lifted from my eyes. Elaine's meddlesome quips had been mercurial little taunts, a campaign of psychological sabotage targeting the closest and most cherished part of her only son's life. My blood turned to ice as a new, unsettling possibility suddenly sprang to mind. Milo's warnings could have been deadly accurate. What if Elaine wasn't just voicing innocuous disapproval, but was actively plotting to thwart our efforts to conceive at every turn? Dear God, what depths had that woman's machinations plumbed? As I watched stunned realization slowly bloom across Alex's face, the dam inside me burst, unleashing a torrent of recriminations bubbling up from the past several years. Every innocuous moment between us, every perceived slight from Elaine, every prior assumption was shattered and recontextualized into something infinitely more sinister. This was no mere clash between overzealous mother-in-law and daughter-in-law. It was all part of a calculated power play waged against the happiness of my own family. I can't believe she'd go that far, Alex stammered, his voice hoarse and constricted as the weight of the appalling realization hit him. My God, Bryn, what the hell has she been up to behind our backs? My jaw clenched as determination surged through me like an electric current. If Elaine thought she'd slink back into the shadows after stirring this nest of vipers, she had another thing coming. One way or another, I would uncover the truth. No matter how dark the revelations, how damning the evidence, come hell or high water, I would drag every last one of her secrets into the light. Steeling myself, I met Alex's stricken gaze with grim resolution. I don't know, I stated with more calm than I felt, but I'm sure as hell going to find out. No more lies, no more tricks. It all ends now. I felt a jagged anticipation swirling within, not unlike a cornered animal sensing a predator's approach. Elaine had vastly underestimated how far I was willing to go to protect my family. Mother-in-law or not, it was past time I turned the tables on her poisonous games. After all, karma wasn't always a merciful mistress, as she was about to discover firsthand. I spent the next several days sifting through a disjointed trail of breadcrumbs and half-remembered inconsistencies from the past, determined to piece together the full extent of Elaine's misdeeds. The more I unearthed, the more nauseated I became at the sheer depths of her duplicity. Heated discussions with Alex yielded recollections of misplaced medical files from his OB/GYN office and Elaine's repeated insistence on joining us for every fertility clinic appointment in spite of our protestations. Offhand remarks she made about the side effects of my prescribed medications began to take on more disturbing connotations. It was during a late-night Google binge that the final, damning pieces clicked into place. I sat bolt upright in bed, my heart pounding as I absorbed the information on the overview for Hypomatic, a medication primarily used to treat polycystic ovarian syndrome, but also routinely prescribed for infertility issues. Elaine had slipped it into her own casual references several times, randomly bringing up the drug's purported side effects of fatigue, nausea, and severe disruptions to a woman's menstrual cycle. My blood turned to ice as I recalled the protracted stretches of debilitating cramps and unpredictable spotting of the past few years, issues my OBGYN had repeatedly chalked up to stress or hormonal imbalances. All this time, we'd been inadvertently poisoning my chances of conceiving, but not by mistake, by insidious, premeditated design. "Alex," I hissed, shoving his slumbering form, "wake up, this is serious." 2 weeks later, I stared grimly at the faces of my assembled family and in-laws, mentally bracing myself for what was to come. Elaine primped and fretted over her doting audience as usual, clueless to the reckoning that awaited. I caught her mid-flow, skewering her with an unwavering look. "Elaine!" Her theatrical prattling cut off as abruptly as a record scratching. Surprise flickered across her features. "Why, Bryn?" she tittered, pasting on a look of sugary faux innocence. "What an unexpected interruption. You're being terribly rude, dear." I felt Alex shift his stance beside me, a tectonic plate preparing to unleash its fury. "Rude?" I echoed softly, my tone dangerously level. "You want to lecture me on rude?" Her mask faltered just a bit, revealed a glimmer of reptilian blankness. I seized on it like a falcon spotting its prey's vulnerability. "When did it start, Elaine?" I demanded, determined not to let her wrest back control of the conversation. "A year ago? 5? Or did your pathological mania to undermine Alex's happiness start even before we were married?" A spattering of tense murmurs, shuffling feet. She cast an imperious glance around the room. Any other time, those present would have folded like a circus tent beneath her withering stare. Today, however, her usual sycophants merely exchanged wary, sidelong looks, feeding off the undercurrents of tension. I didn't give her an opportunity to regain her bearings. "You've spent years sabotaging every attempt we made to start a family," I declared, raising my chin in grim defiance. "Switched medications, planted self-doubt, forged medical records. Am I even scratching the surface?" The atmosphere was charged with stunned silence. It was as if I'd let the air out of the proverbial room with an icy exhale. My eyes bored into Elaine's, unblinking. I wasn't a woman prone to histrionics or shallow appeals for sympathy, but the circus master before me had pushed beyond any reasonable boundaries. It was time to reveal the viper lurking behind the curtain, teeth and all. "Well?" I challenged, my words slicing through the vacuum as I unleashed the full brunt of my fury. "What's your excuse, Elaine? I hope it's more compelling than envy or some twisted need to control your son." "How dare you?" Her voice emerged laced with a venom as potent as her actions, dripping with a quiet rage that made the hairs on my arms stand on end. But I refused to shrink before the sputtering forge of her indignant ire. It was her turn to cower beneath my glare's menacing weight. "You sanctimonious little mother!" A thick, furious bellow rent the air. It was Alex, his face a twisted mask of betrayal and incandescent rage. My normally mild-mannered husband was unrecognizable, every tightly coiled wire wound from years of abuse snapping in a blinding instant. I cannot fathom the level of abject evil it took to do something like this to your own family, he growled in a voice even lower and more terrifying than his outburst. "To your own blood." Elaine's jaw worked furiously, struggling to formulate a response. For one fleeting instant, I caught a glimpse of the naked fear in her eyes. Good, I thought in a moment of callous savagery. Let her seize in terror over the fire she'd willfully stoked. How I wish I could savor that momentary flicker of weakness longer, but a whiplash of movement and sound drew my eyes away. Just as Dominic lunged to his feet, his arms rigid at his sides as his body went ramrod straight. I followed his burning, accusatory gaze over to where Elaine stiffened, caught in the crossfire. It dawned on me then with dawning certitude and horror. The oblivious golden child knew nothing of his mother's twisted machinations, until now. The tableau before us crystallized into a grotesque artifice, a brittle dollhouse facade concealing a nest of vipers far deadlier than we'd imagined. Yet even amid the carnage lay a tragic figure, a perpetually favored son opening his eyes for the first time to the rot lurking within his clan's foundation. I opened my mouth, but no sound emerged. What remained to be said? The damage had been wrought, the reckoning delivered. The shattered shards of our once idyllic existence lay strewn at our feet like a broken mirror. There was no piecing anything back together. Not after this. In the suffocating silence that blanketed the room, you could have heard a pin drop. Elaine remained rooted in place, her chin jutting out in a defiant tilt as she dared us with those reptilian eyes to make the next move. Alex and I steeled ourselves, squaring our shoulders as if bracing for an imminent attack. It was Dominic who finally broke the spell, shattering the fragile stalemate with a choked utterance. "Mom?" The plaintiveness in his tone sliced through me, conjuring an image of a frightened child pleading for reassurance from the monsters under his bed. My heart twisted in sorrow and impotent anger over the innocence that monster had shattered for us all. Elaine pivoted on her heel to face her youngest, her eyebrows arched in a look of haughty innocence that would have been convincing, if not for the smear of panic telegraphed in her strained features. "Well, don't just gawk at me like one of your insipid beta fish, Dominic," she snapped with a derisive wave of her hand. "Your sister-in-law is clearly deranged if she thinks—" "Don't," Dominic interrupted, his voice hardening to a tone I'd never heard from the normally affable man. "I beg your pardon?" Elaine sputtered, aghast at the unaccustomed insolence from her favored golden child. Dominic swallowed hard, seeming to steady himself with a deep breath. When his gaze alighted on his mother once more, it smoldered with a quiet fury. "Don't insult me by denying it outright," he said in a voice as taut as a tripwire, "or try deflecting with empty insults about Bryn and Alex's imagined mental state." He took a halting step forward, each footfall like the weight of an immense burden being lowered onto his shoulders. "Not after hearing that horrific revelation with my own 2 ears." Elaine issued a soft cluck of disapproval, patting his cheek in an almost maternal gesture, utterly at odds with the circumstances. "Oh, pish, you're working yourself into such an unnecessary state over some baseless accusations." "Enough!" Dominic bellowed with such abrupt ferocity that even I flinched. Elaine recoiled, shrinking back a few paces from this heretofore unseen side of her offspring. "My God," he muttered, raking a shaky hand through his hair. "I don't even know who you are anymore, if I ever really did. What kind of twisted, unforgivable thing did you do?" His mother seemed to wilt further and further with each lash of his furious denunciations. She shook her head almost plaintively, as if desperately beseeching him to somehow understand. I'd witnessed enough toxic dissolution of family dynamics to recognize the dispiriting signs. Suspicion calcifying into immovable factions, once unshakable allegiances fracturing under the weight of ugly revelations. My jaw clenched as memories of my own parents' acrimonious divorce came rushing back like a surging tide. The writing was on the wall, spelling an all-too-familiar and heart-rending endgame that had unfolded again and again throughout my lifetime. The disintegration of what had once been a family unit into splintered shards. One wounded soul cowering under the tearful accusation of his betrayer's own offspring. Another puffing up in impotent rage at having his hypocrisy shattered beyond any hope of reconstruction. There were simply no winners to be had in such minefields. Only depleted souls sifting through the rubble, desperate for a path out of their fractured reality. Then Alex shifted his stance slightly beside me, and my gaze instinctively followed suit. What I saw in his eyes stopped me cold. A piercing look of singular determination, glinting like a naked blade being unsheathed. Gone was the wounded filial heartbreak over yet another of his mother's callous deceptions. In its place smoldered the stoic resolve of a man implacably set on a harsh course, whatever heroic defiance or scorched earth lay in his path. Not for the first time, I marveled at the depth of steely backbone that my husband possessed when finally roused from complacency. Few had the privilege of witnessing this side of Alex, but those who did knew to stand well clear of the blast radius. He caught me staring and responded with an infinitesimal shake of his head. so slight as to be imperceptible to the others. Those eyes locked onto mine pointedly, silently conveying a message of unspoken solidarity. This ends now. No more games, no more retreats. And as I searched his unyielding countenance for any vestige of weakness or ambivalence, a new emotion welled up from my core, a grim sense of vengeful duty spreading like an ink blot over my heart. He was right. In that instant, I knew there was no redemption left to be salvaged, no shattered remnants worth preserving. Everything had been irrevocably shattered. The path forward led through an inescapable point of no return. Our family's sole path to justice lay in that scorched earth stretched before us like a gauntlet, beckoning with the promise of a peace that could only be bought with retribution. No matter what merciless destiny awaited us there, one thing was certain. Elaine Harrison's days of treacherous machinations against her own blood were officially over. One way or another, this generational saga of lies and betrayal would end with us. Come what may, karma would finally be delivered its due. The days following our cataclysmic family confrontation passed in a blur. Elaine shored up what tattered defenses remained, alternating between feigning indignant outrage over our baseless allegations and meek supplications begging for reconciliation. Alex and I were having none of it. We'd glimpsed the noxious truth festering at his family's core, and there was no dispelling that miasma through appeasement or half measures. Dominic had fallen into a brooding silence in the aftermath, lost in the disorienting realization that the idyllic childhood he'd known had been an artifice erected on lies and betrayal. I ached for him, recalling how it felt to have the naive blinders ripped away from my own eyes during my parents' divorce. For his part, Alex had slipped into what I'd coined his thermal exhaust port mode, cool, taciturn, and entirely focused on systematically dismantling the adversary piece by piece. It was unnervingly at odds with the laid-back charmer I'd fallen for. But in these circumstances, I couldn't deny a fierce sense of gratitude for this ruthless new side of him. When he informed me of his meticulously mapped stratagem, I shuddered, not at the calculated zealotry, but from the glacial understanding that animated it. We were well and truly past the point of civilized recourse with Elaine. The time for polite niceties had expired. The first salvo came 4 days after the fracturing, as I'd begun calling it. Alex invited Elaine to a cleared-the-air lunch, ostensibly to give her a chance at a truthful explanation for her appalling actions. Like a moth drawn to a flame, she readily accepted, clearly self-deluded enough to believe she could slither her way out of judgment through artful obfuscations and crocodile tears. Upon her arrival, she was ushered not to a private dining room as expected, but through a service corridor leading to a sealed conference room. There, assembled around a long table, sat a grim-faced tribunal. Alex, Dominic, and 6 other individuals whose stern visages I recognized from the various legal filings accumulated over the past several weeks of clandestine preparation. Elaine faltered, a flash of stunned unease momentarily shattering her poise before the courtly mask was repositioned. "What is the meaning of this unseemly gathering?" "Have a seat, Elaine," Alex stated flatly, gesturing towards a lone chair positioned before the panel. She bristled, drawing herself up in affronted hauteur. "I will do no such thing until someone—" "Mother?" Dominic's rumbled rebuke stopped her cold. He regarded her with undisguised umbrage, as if staring at something distasteful stuck to the bottom of his shoe. My heart clenched painfully at the depth of his barely restrained contempt. This time Elaine's mask slipped entirely, if only for an instant. The naked hurt and bewilderment etched across her features would have seemed pitiful if I didn't recognize it for what it truly was. The desperate lashing out of an inveterate manipulator being cut off from her supply lines. "Dominic," she croaked, reaching out a placating hand. "Surely you can't." "Just sit down, please," he ground out, unable to even maintain eye contact any longer. Something inside her seemed to wilt as the weight of her awful solitude finally registered. Sinking into the proffered chair, she cast a wary, wounded look around the assembled officiants, then finally settled on Alex's thunderous countenance with pleading resignation. I tensed at his answering look of harsh finality, gripping the edge of the table with white knuckles. For all the unforgivable slights and crushed hopes, there was no prepared salve to ease the pain of the impending denouement. just a scalpel to excise the gangrenous limb poisoning our family once and for all. But we had come too far for last-second cold feet. Taking a steadying breath, he withdrew a thick manila folder containing what had to be hundreds of pages of documentation from across the table. You are being presented today with the full body of evidence detailing a years-long conspiracy to undermine your own family, he intoned in a tone of such solemn gravity it was as if rendering a judge's verdict rather than merely addressing his mother. Forgeries, defamations, willful obfuscation bordering on felonious acts against my wife and I, he continued, each word seemingly to strike Elaine with the weight of a sledgehammer blow, all in order to sabotage our efforts to conceive a child and secure your twisted control over this family and its bloodline. The proclamations kept coming, an inexorable avalanche of accusations, each infinitely more damning than the last, all couched in a meticulously cultivated portfolio of proof. And most damningly, each one was enumerated not just by Alex, but affirmed by a cadre of expert witnesses delineating chapter and verse of her elaborate offenses under oath. How I had underestimated his preparation, his ability to surgically dismantle her nefarious agenda through the path of maximum pain. The barrage was as merciless as it was inescapable, laying bare the wretched truth in all its lurid monstrosity. Elaine's villainy had metastasized into a cancer that would take down the entire family structure. And now, the scourge was being savagely exercised through its only course of treatment, absolute admission and recompense. There would be no more obfuscation, no more evasive parlor tricks or hollow deniability. Only the unvarnished truth and its inexorable consequences. Do you understand the depth of what you've done? Alex's voice lashed out as the final witness's proclamation hung in the air like a death knell. Elaine sat slumped, vacant and deflated, like a collapsed marionette whose strings had all been severed. Her haunted gaze flicked up, registering my face fleetingly before drifting back to Alex's accusatory glare. How could you do this to your own mother? She rasped, in a voice parched of all pretense. I expected Alex to spit out a contemptuous rebuttal reminding her of the sins that had precipitated this occasion, but instead, he merely exhaled through his nose with a sort of weary resignation. I'm not doing anything, he said with a chilling finality that seemed to splinter whatever remained of Elaine's bluster into powder. This is simply karma's hand finally being dealt. Then, in front of God and the assembled witnesses, Elaine Harrison, once imperious matriarch and merciless puppeteer of our family's fate, crumbled into silent, bitter weeping. And for all the satisfaction I'd imagined would accompany such a cathartic comeuppance, I felt nothing but a hollow, gaping sadness. Our vendetta had been achieved, yet at what terrible cost. Autumn's crisp breezes carried the bittersweet aroma of decaying leaves that fateful afternoon, an olfactory harbinger of change and renewal threading through the twilight air. Sometimes the simplest moments trigger the most profound revelations. For me, it happened as I cradled Mila in my arms, entranced by her cherubic features while she slumbered peacefully against my chest. The rhythmic rise and fall of her tiny back lulled me into a trance-like reverie punctuated only by the occasional bird-song from the backyard. I stroked the downy wisps of sable hair crowning her head, so dark and unruly, already mirroring my own unmanageable mane. A faint smile tugged at my lips as I committed every facet of her appearance to memory. Her rosebud lips, the faint dusting of freckles stippled across her elfin nose, even the little crease that furrowed between her eyebrows whenever she fussed. Most of all, those long-lashed eyes that had captivated me the instant they'd opened to gaze up at me in the delivery room. Not a muddy hazel like her father, but rather a striking peridot, the color of new spring grass. I tensed reflexively as a lock suddenly clicked downstairs. All it took was the faintest rustling from the hall to rouse Mila from her slumber, prompting a sleepy gurgle and soft coo. Within seconds, Alex's looming shadow materialized in the nursery's doorway, his face melting into a beatific grin. "Hey there, Munchkin." He crossed to us in 2 strides, bending to drop a tender kiss to Mila's crown. "Keeping your mama company while she holds down the fort? And what adventures did you get up to out in the big wide world today?" I teased, tipping my chin up to accept his lingering kiss. As he drew back, I couldn't help but bask in the glow of adoration warming his eyes. That same enamored look that never failed to reduce me to a giddy puddle even now, almost 9 years into our marriage. "Nothing too exciting," he murmured, settling onto the armchair beside us, while casually unbuttoning his collar. A soft chuckle rumbled in his chest as Mila instinctively swiveled her head towards the sound of his voice, already enthralled. "Just the usual media sales pitches and schmoozing clients over catered lunches," Alex continued with a wink in my direction. "But enough about me. This little peanut is clearly the star of the show today." He cocked his head to regard Mila's saucer-like gaze trained upon him. "You been behaving yourself for Mommy while I was away, Shortcake?" I chuckled mirthfully at his sing-song tone, the very picture of a besotted new father delighting in his offspring. When Mila's tiny hand emerged from beneath her swaddle to bat playfully at his face, Alex sputtered with unbridled elation. "Oh, I see how it is, Missy. Trying to rough up your old man right from the outset, huh?" We relished in Mila's ensuing giggles, joyous peals of laughter ringing out like silver bells in the peaceful hush of the nursery. In that instant, it was as if all the heartache and torment of the preceding years had been banished to a distant, cobwebbed recess, lost amid the simple rapture of being present with those dearest to you. As Mila's laughs subsided into intermittent coos, I caught Alex's eyes flitting towards the antique crib positioned in the corner. My breath caught for a moment as I followed his gaze, taking in the hand-carved detailing depicting leaping gazelles and swooping birds mid-flight. It was the same crib Alex's father had painstakingly restored and gifted to us. How many times had Alex run his fingers over those grooves, channeling his grief over whether we'd ever get the chance to use it for its intended purpose? Too many to count. In retrospect, our soaring hopes crushed again and again by one insidious force. As if in tune with my introspective turn, Alex's face grew solemn. Something indiscernible flickered behind his eyes before vanishing just as quickly. He rested his palm over my knee, giving it an affectionate squeeze. "Hard to believe it was less than a year ago that all the drama went down," he murmured in a hushed tone, as if not to disturb Mila's attention. My mind immediately jolted back to that fateful day in the conference room. Elaine's utter debasement as every scheme and conspiracy became an ineradicable part of the permanent record, carved into stone through testimony and documentation. How her papery, thin veneer of genteel grace and propriety had disintegrated under the weight of her wrongdoings being laid bare for all to witness. I swallowed thickly against the sudden lump in my throat. I'll never forget the look on her face that day, like the mask had finally shattered beyond any hope of repair. Alex's features tightened into a pained grimace I knew all too well, the echoes of a complicated, still unresolved relationship with his mother that seemed destined to haunt him for years to come. There were simply too many emotional fault lines fractured that day for any of us to achieve total closure. I did what needed to be done, for us and for the family, that he stated in a low, resolute tone that betrayed only the faintest quaver of lingering uncertainty. Still, I can't help but wonder if I was too heavy-handed. My free hand instinctively found his, our fingers interlacing. There would be no easy balm to heal those old emotional gouges, not entirely. But perhaps with time, and the all-consuming joy radiating out of our long-awaited miracle nestled between us, we could begin to rebuild anew on firmer ground. "You protected us and our future, Alex, against any threat, no matter how twisted or dark," I said, offering a reassuring squeeze. "That's all a good father ever needs to do." His grateful smile in response was enough to fill my heart to overflowing. Then Mila cooed softly again, drawing our rapt attention back to her cherubic mug like twin sunflowers turning towards the light. As I relished the sight of my beautiful daughter radiating undiluted joy and innocence, Milo's uncanny words from all those months ago reverberated in my mind's eye like a mantra, of triumph emerging from devastation, of light piercing the void. A daughter whose existence had only manifested through hard-won recompense for the very blackest betrayal. The living, breathing embodiment of karma's unbowed perseverance and the remarkable power of human resilience against even the most implacable darkness. No matter what convulsions had rocked our family's foundations to their core, in this tranquil moment of joy and renewal, we had prevailed. Scars would remain, of course, for all our catharsis, the past could never be truly expunged. But here at last was our chance to forge ahead anew. One single wondrous life offered up an opportunity, not just for a fresh chapter, but as the first radiant strains of an entirely new family saga, all thanks to that most delicate yet undaunted of human virtues, hope.